Hello, everyone. As you may or may not know, September is Achalasia Awareness Month. I am a few days late. I do apologize, but I would like to tell you my story. Here's a little bit about what achalasia is first. Achalasia is a disorder that makes it difficult for food and liquids to pass from the swallowing tube connecting your mouth and stomach. Achalasia occurs when nerves in the esophagus become damaged. As a result, the esophagus becomes paralyzed and dilated over time and eventually loses the ability to squeeze food down into the stomach. Food then collects in the esophagus sometimes and washes back up into the mouth, which can taste bitter. There are 3 stages to achalasia. Moderate, which usually just requires stretching of the lower sphincter muscles so that food and liquids can pass through. Then there is severe, and then end stage. I have been through all the stages. Here's the experiences that I have had. In 1992, when I was living in Winnipeg, I am now living in Edmonton, Alberta, by the way, my stomach muscles closed, my esophagus filled with food, and I couldn't eat or drink anything because nothing else went through. I went to 3 doctors to look for help, and none of them knew what was going on, as achalasia wasn't as much known then as it is now. My weight was dropping rapidly. It went from 240 pounds down to 130 pounds in 2 months. So I was referred to a surgeon. He diagnosed me with severe achalasia and performed a Heller myotomy. The Heller myotomy back then was performed by opening up the patient from the side, opening my esophagus, cleaning out the food, and cutting the esophageal sphincter muscle. My esophagus was sealed up with staples, which remained there, and my side was closed with stitching. Nowadays, this procedure, I believe, is done laparoscopically, which I think is much more advanced. I was able to eat soft foods after surgery and did not require a feeding tube. I was in the hospital for a week and was then sent home for the remainder of my recovery. After I recovered, I always had to drink milk as I needed something smooth to wash down my food, as it would always get stuck near my throat. Later on, I switched to pushing my food down with water, and every time I ate a meal, I had to drink at least 1.5 liters of water so that my food would go down. There were days that my food wouldn't go down at all, and I would need to force myself to throw up. This would really bother me sometimes if I went out to eat to a restaurant after paying for a meal and then having to run to the washroom to force myself to throw up. There were days when I was swallowing my food that it hurt so bad that the food would sometimes get stuck in the chest area and it felt like I was having a heart attack. For years, I had many barium swallow x-rays and gastroscopies done. And sometimes I still require for my esophagus to be stretched and dilated. Also for years, I was misdiagnosed with having a hiatal hernia. And in 2017, I went for surgery for this. Now, let me tell you what a barium swallow is. It is performed by drinking a special liquid, then taking x-rays to help see problems in the esophagus, such as swallowing disorders, and the stomach, such as ulcers and tumors. It also shows how big the hiatal hernia is, and if there is twisting of the stomach as a result of the hernia. Now, my esophagus was getting so twisted and dilated that when I would stand facing to the left while the barium swallow is being done, it would look like on the x-ray that I had a hiatal hernia. But if I stood facing to the right, they couldn't see it, and they would say it isn't there. In 2019, I started getting real sick. I was aspirating into my lungs and coughing almost every day and night, and I was diagnosed with pneumonia at least 12 times in 1.5 years. My family doctor then sent me to my specialist. She did a gastroscopy and told me my esophagus was very dilated. She then sent me to another specialist to get a second opinion. He did a gastroscopy also and had to drain about 1 liter of water out of my esophagus. Then I was finally referred to a thoracic surgeon. I was diagnosed with achalasia end stage, and he would need to perform what is called a esophagectomy, if I'm saying that correctly. Now, a esophagectomy is the removal of the esophagus and then is reconstructed by stretching up the stomach. If a person's stomach isn't big enough to stretch up into a new swallowing tube, I have heard of part of the colon being used to do the procedure. I had my surgery on May 25th, 2021. The reason why I waited 2 years was because of financial struggles and because of the pandemic. However, after 2 years, my esophagus was getting much more worse and more dilated, and it was time to get the surgery done. I couldn't wait anymore. After my surgery, I woke up with 3 IVs and a catheter in both my left and right arms, going into an artery, a tube in my neck, a NG tube that goes up the nose and into my stomach, a feeding tube in my stomach that stayed there for 5 weeks, also a chest tube on my right side, a chest tube in my back, a epidermal catheter in my back, a blood pressure cuff, and a heart rate finger monitor. And they wanted me to get up every day with all those things attached to me and walked to prevent blood clots. Now you can imagine how uncomfortable I felt with all those things attached to me. I told the nurses there's no way that I was getting up to walk around. So instead, they injected me with blood thinners in me every day. I wasn't allowed to eat or drink anything for 8 days, and my biggest craving was a ice cold glass of water. Because my mouth and throat was so dry, I felt like I walked in the desert for days. I had a few complications. On day 3, I woke up feeling really cold, and before I knew it, I woke up in ICU with a ventilator on and my arms were tied to the bed. Sorry, folks, I got a little bit of a cold here today. Anyways, they put me under without me knowing and said I aspirated, even though my surgeon told me the next day there was no sign of any aspirating. On day 6, a barium swallow was done. They said everything was looking good and I was starting to eat soft foods, even though my surgeon said that was a little premature. He told me to take it slow. Day 7, I was finding it very hard to walk around, and I was getting very short of breath, and my surgeon told me it will take at least a year to get back my strength. Day 8, all my tests and everything else were looking good, and I was sent home. When I was sent home, I was having a very difficult time sleeping, and I was as I was always coughing and aspirating, no matter how much I elevated my bed. So I had to try sleeping sitting up, and I only slept about 1 hour to 2 hours per night. I was thinking, is this how life is going to be now? Day 3, being at home, I noticed that I was starting to break out in a fever. And any time that I tried walking around or climbing my stairs, I would be completely winded, and I had a hard time breathing. So my wife took me to urgent care on June 4th, 2021, which is just a few days later after my release from the hospital. They ran an x-ray on me and found that my lungs were getting filled up with fluids and I had infections. They had to put 2 more IVs in me once again. I was then transferred back to the hospital where my surgery was for a CT scan and more x-rays. The results showed that my stomach that the surgeon pulled up had a leak about 3 millimeters big. Sorry, not my stomach. My tube that got reconstructed from my stomach had a leak in it. And I had to go back on the operating table again. They opened me up once more and clipped the leak closed. For 6 days, I was allowed to suck on a very small amount of ice cubes, about a half a cup a day only. But I wasn't allowed to eat or drink anything again. On day 7, I was allowed to start eating once more in a very small portions, as swallowing was quite uncomfortable, as there didn't seem like much room for food or liquids to pass through, and I was throwing up fluids. But the surgeon did tell me it will get easier over time. Day 9, I was sent home once again. Then 3 days later, I started feeling sick and dehydrated. I went back to the hospital where my surgery was. They said my white blood count was a little high, but nothing to worry about, and they sent me home. Then another day went by, and I was feeling much worse. I then went back to the hospital. They found that I was extremely dehydrated, and I was throwing up bile a lot. I was kept in the hospital for 3 days under observation and was given IV fluids before being sent home again. Now, ever since my surgery, the one thing that I've really struggled with is staying hydrated. My body just doesn't seem to absorb as much liquids as a normal person does, and I get very dehydrated daily. So anyways, now, for the first time in now 29 years, I'm able to eat all my food without liquids to push it down. However, now that my stomach got stretched up, to make a new swallowing tube, my stomach is reduced in size from a normal stomach to a very small size. So when I eat, it has to be smaller meals because the tube gets filled up to my throat and can take up to a couple hours to go through. If I try to drink any water in that time, everything might back up while it's sitting in my tube. So that's another reason why it's very hard for me to drink liquids while I'm eating. So it's basically the complete opposite as it was for the last 29 years. So now, the one thing that helps the food go down now is by burping, to clear the air from my esophagus. Some people cannot drink with a straw or chew gum because it fills up air in the esophagus and makes it harder to swallow food. I do aspirate at night sometimes still, but nowhere as much as before. Since the surgery, I've had severe back pain and pain in my ribs that I'm hoping will get better over time. I have heard that this is common with people that have had this surgery. I now also have what is called dumping syndrome. Now, dumping syndrome is a medical condition in which your stomach empties its contents into the first part of your small intestine faster than a normal person. Dumping syndrome is also known as rapid gastric emptying. People with dumping syndrome experience symptoms like nausea, abdominal pain, cramping, bloating, diarrhea, vomiting, flushing, headaches, hypotension, palpitations, tremors, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and hunger. These things can happen from eating too big of a meal, or if there is too much sugar or caffeine in your diet. And it can also vary from person to person with achalasia. Dumping syndrome can occur at any time during the day, and when it does, you can lose control of your bowels. Unfortunately, this has happened to me. Also, for the past 29 years, I have taken a drug called pantoprazole, also known as Pantoloc, for this illness, and it weakens your bone structure from an ingredient in it called PPI. I never knew about this until about 2 years ago, and I have been taking it, like I said, for 29 years. So anyways, PPI stands for proton pump inhibitors. They are medicines that work by reducing the amount of stomach acid made by glands in the lining of your stomach. I have fractured many bones from how much this drug weakens your structure, and I have been diagnosed with osteoporosis because of it. A person that has achalasia also doesn't absorb nutrients in their body the way a normal person would, and the most common thing would be iron deficiency. That is something that a doctor normally doesn't check on routine blood work. So if you have achalasia, keep an eye on your vitamin and iron levels. People with achalasia have had to get their iron and vitamins through IV, as our body do not absorb enough. The one thing that I struggle with right now since my surgery is staying hydrated. My body doesn't seem to absorb enough water, which is also common with people that have had this surgery. I think I mentioned that earlier. But anyways, for anybody that has had achalasia, there is a couple of support groups on Facebook. One of them is just called Achalasia Support Group, and the other one is called Esophagectomy for Achalasia. I would recommend you join these groups for help and support, and if you have any questions that you need answered. Also, please feel free to share my story. Thank you. God bless. Good luck to you on your journey. Bye-bye.